But what happens when the past, a phantom of shadows and violence, refuses to stay buried and threatens to shatter everything you hold dear? What do you do when the quiet ranch you call home becomes the battlefield for a war you thought you'd escaped? After listening to the whole story, you will definitely share your opinion in the comments. So let's move towards the story. The old ranch, nestled deep within the whispering pines and rolling hills, had always been John's sanctuary. For 20 years, it had been his canvas, a testament to a life painstakingly rebuilt, brick by quiet brick. Here, the sunrise painted the sky in hues of amber and rose, and the only sound were the soft whinny of horses and the gentle murmur of the wind through the tall grass. John, with his weathered hands and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 sunsets, embodied the very spirit of the land. He was a man of routines, of quiet strength, his days filled with the rhythm of mending fences, tending to a small herd, and the solitary companionship of his loyal dog, Buster. Yet, beneath the gentle exterior, beneath the lines etched by sun and time, lay a history as vast and complex as the land itself. A history he had meticulously, painstakingly buried. A legend, perhaps, to some, a ghost story to others, but to John, it was simply the past, a dark chapter he had sealed away with the kind of absolute finality only those who have truly touched the abyss can understand. His peace wasn't accidental. It was cultivated, a deliberate act of will after years spent navigating a world where trust was a luxury and survival was the only currency. He had traded the shadows of clandestine operations for the honest dirt beneath his fingernails, the deafening silence of covert missions for the comforting sounds of his ranch. The scars he carried weren't just physical. They were etched deep into his soul, remnants of a life lived on the razor's edge. He'd seen the worst of humanity, faced betrayal that cut deeper than any blade, and made choices that haunted his quiet nights. But here, on this ranch, surrounded by the simple beauty of nature, he had found a semblance of healing, a fragile kind of contentment that he clung to with the tenacity of a man who knew what it was to lose everything. He wasn't naive. He knew the world outside his fences was still a harsh, unforgiving place. He kept his skills sharp, not out of a desire for conflict, but out of a deep-seated understanding that true peace often required the ability to defend it. His solitude wasn't loneliness. It was a chosen path, a necessary balm for a soul that had witnessed too much. The Syndicate, a shadowy organization known for its brutal efficiency and sprawling criminal enterprise, operated with a ruthless disregard for anyone who stood in their way. Their reach extended far and wide, their tendrils weaving through the fabric of society, corrupting, exploiting, and destroying. They were a hydra, cutting off one head only for two more to rise in its place. Their latest target, a seemingly insignificant piece of land adjacent to John's ranch, held a strategic importance they were desperate to acquire. It was a perfect staging ground, a hidden gem that would allow them to expand their illicit operations unchecked. They sent their enforcers, a hardened crew led by a man named Victor, a creature of pure calculation and cold violence, to seize the land. Victor's reputation preceded him. He was a blunt instrument, designed for one purpose: to get the job done, no matter the cost. He saw the world in terms of conquest and control, and anyone who dared to resist was simply an obstacle to be removed. He was confident, arrogant even, in his mission, believing that a secluded rancher would pose no threat, a mere footnote in their grand scheme. The first sign of trouble came subtly, a shift in the air, a whisper of unease that prickled at John's instincts. A broken fence post, an unfamiliar vehicle on the distant road, a rustle in the woods that wasn't just the wind. Small things, easily dismissed by others, but not by John. His years of training, his life forged in the crucible of danger, had honed his senses to an almost supernatural degree. He felt the shift, the subtle ripple in the fabric of his peaceful existence, long before any physical threat materialized. He watched, he waited, he listened, observing the landscape with the intensity of a predator, yet the patience of a farmer. He knew, deep in his bones, that something was coming. The Syndicate, in their arrogant short-sightedness, saw only a quiet old man on a secluded ranch, an easy mark. They couldn't have been more wrong. They were about to stumble into a hornet's nest, unaware that the quiet rancher was a legend, a ghost from their own shadowy world, a force they had long feared but believed to be long gone. The stage was set, not for a simple takeover, but for a confrontation that would unearth old ghosts, test the limits of a man's resilience, and redefine the meaning of justice. The peace John had built was about to be shattered, and the world was about to be reminded of the sleeping giant they had so foolishly awoken. The Syndicate's initial approach was subtle, almost dismissive in its arrogance. They sent their scouts first, men who moved with a calculated nonchalance, observing John's routines, mapping the terrain, assessing what they believed was an easy target. John, however, was no ordinary target. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every glint of sun on a distant vehicle, every unnatural stillness in the usually vibrant woods was registered, analyzed, and filed away in the extraordinary database that was his mind. He moved with a quiet purpose, his senses extended, his awareness encompassing every inch of his property and beyond. He noticed the fresh tracks near his northern fence line, the subtly moved stone that marked an old trail, the fainter-than-usual scent of pine where someone had recently passed. These were not the signs of casual hikers. These were the signatures of trained individuals, people who understood concealment, but not at the level John did. He recognized the pattern, the methodical reconnaissance of an organization preparing for an encroachment. The wolf had sniffed the sheep, but this sheep was no ordinary flock animal. He began to adapt, his routines shifting almost imperceptibly. His morning rides extended further into the wilder parts of his land, not for enjoyment, but for surveillance. He checked his old, hidden caches of supplies, ensuring they were still viable. His evenings were spent not by the crackling fireplace, but by the windows, a quiet sentinel, observing the shifting shadows, listening to the night sounds with an intensity that few could comprehend. Buster, his faithful companion, seemed to sense the change in his master, his usually playful demeanor replaced by a watchful stillness, his low growls a confirmation of John's own deepening suspicions. John knew, with an unsettling certainty, that the peace he had meticulously built was about to be shattered. This wasn't just about land. It was about the Syndicate's expanding grip, their belief that they could take whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted, with impunity. And he, John, was an inconvenient, overlooked detail. The first direct confrontation came disguised as an innocent inquiry. A slick, well-dressed man, clearly not from around these parts, drove up to John's gate one afternoon, a forced smile plastered on his face. He spoke of land development, of opportunities, of a generous offer for John's ranch. John listened, his face an impassive mask, his eyes, however, missing nothing. The tremor in the man's hand as he clutched a briefcase, the way his gaze darted nervously towards the tree-lean, the barely concealed impatience in his voice. John's refusal was polite but firm, delivered with a quiet authority that seemed to momentarily unnerve the Syndicate's emissary. The man left, his forced smile replaced by a look of cold calculation, the implied threat hanging heavy in the air. John watched him go, a grim understanding settling over him. The negotiation phase was over. Soon after, the veiled threats escalated. Mysterious power outages, cut phone lines, the sudden appearance of strange vehicles parked on the road, leading to his ranch, their occupants simply watching. They were trying to isolate him, to wear him down, to make him feel vulnerable. But vulnerability was a concept John had long ago conquered. Each attempt to intimidate him served only to sharpen his focus, to awaken the dormant predator within. He knew their playbook, had written chapters of it himself in another life. They were testing his resolve, trying to gauge his weaknesses. What they didn't know was that his greatest strength lay in his apparent ordinariness, his quiet life concealing a storm of capability. The Syndicate, in their hubris, saw an old man. John saw a battlefield being drawn, and he was ready to defend his home, not just as a piece of land, but as the last bastion of his hard-won peace. The lines were being drawn, and the quiet rancher was preparing for a war he never wanted, but one he was uniquely equipped to fight. The Syndicate's patience, never a strong suit, began to wear thin. Victor, growing increasingly frustrated by the old rancher's stubborn resilience, decided to escalate. He wasn't a man for subtle tactics. He preferred direct action, a swift and brutal show of force to break any resistance. One night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, a heavily armed crew descended upon John's ranch. Their vehicles, modified for silence and speed, approached like predatory shadows, their engines barely a whisper against the chirping of crickets. They moved with a practiced efficiency, spreading out to encircle the main house, their movements precise, confident, and utterly devoid of mercy. They expected a quick, one-sided engagement, perhaps a few desperate shots from a frightened old man before he was overwhelmed. They expected fear, surrender, and ultimately compliance. They were about to learn the true meaning of underestimation. John was ready. He had been waiting for this. The escalating threats, the surveillance, the thinly veiled warnings, they were all part of a familiar prelude, a dance he had performed countless times in a past life. His ranch, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a fortress, not of stone and steel, but of meticulous preparation and an intimate knowledge of the land. He had rigged silent alarms, created escape routes, and positioned himself in strategic vantage points. His senses, honed by years of living on the edge, picked up the subtle crunch of gravel, the almost imperceptible shift in the night air, the faint metallic scent of weapons. He moved through his darkened house with the silent grace of a ghost, his hand automatically reaching for the familiar weight of his silenced pistol, a tool he had hoped he would never need again. Buster, sensing the imminent danger, stood motionless beside him, a low, guttural rumble in his chest, his eyes fixed on the shadows outside. The first breach came from the south, a team attempting to cut the main power line. John anticipated their move, a flicker of movement in the infrared scope of his rifle confirming their presence. He didn't aim to kill, not yet. His goal was to disorient, to sow confusion, to remind them that this wasn't a defenseless target. A single, precisely placed shot severed a wire, sending a shower of sparks and plunging that section of the ranch into deeper darkness. Then another, disabling a generator they were attempting to use to bypass the cuts. The Syndicate operatives, initially startled, recovered quickly, but a ripple of unease spread through their ranks. This wasn't the easy job they had been promised. As the Syndicate men pushed closer, they found themselves facing an invisible opponent. Tripwires triggered flares, momentarily blinding them. Hidden speakers blared disorienting sounds, echoing through the night. Shadows seemed to move independently, creating phantom threats. John moved through the chaos he orchestrated, a silent conductor of mayhem. He wasn't just defending. He was orchestrating, manipulating the environment, turning their advantage into a disadvantage. He used his knowledge of the terrain, of the winding paths and hidden dips, to outmaneuver them, appearing and disappearing like smoke. He disabled their communication, jammed their signals, turning their coordinated assault into a fragmented, chaotic search-and-destroy mission against a phantom. The air grew thick with frustration and mounting fear among Victor's men. This was no ordinary rancher. This was something else entirely, something they had only heard whispers about in the darkest corners of their world. A legend, perhaps, come back to haunt them. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Syndicate, so confident in their power, was slowly beginning to realize they had walked into a trap. Victor, observing the chaos from a safe distance, felt a cold dread begin to coil in his gut. His men, hardened and experienced, were falling into disarray. Their confident advance had devolved into a panicked scramble, their shouts of coordination replaced by exclamations of confusion and alarm. He watched, incredulous, as his tactical display showed operatives getting disoriented, triggering unexpected alarms, and even firing at shadows. This wasn't an ordinary defense. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a dismantling of his crew's morale piece by piece. He had encountered resistance before, even fierce gunfights, but never anything like this. It was as if the ranch itself was fighting back, orchestrated by an unseen, terrifyingly competent force. The whispers about an old ghost, a legend from the covert world, began to echo in his mind, growing louder, more insistent. Could it be? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Inside the house, John moved with a fluid grace that belied his years. Each action was deliberate, precise. He wasn't just reacting. He was dictating the terms of engagement. He used the ranch's natural contours, the moon's infrequent illumination through the clouds, and even the sounds of the night to his advantage. He disabled the Syndicate's heavy vehicles with well-aimed shots to their engines, stranding their support teams. He unleashed Buster, who, with a fierce joy, harried and confused the scattered operatives, his barks and snarls adding to the terrifying cacophony. John's eyes, usually warm and tired, now held a sharp, dangerous glint, reflecting the resurgence of the dormant warrior within. The past, the life he had buried, was bleeding into the present, and with it came an almost primal surge of purpose. He was no longer just John, the quiet rancher. He was the operative, the protector, the ghost they had foolishly provoked. One of Victor's most seasoned lieutenants, a brute named Thorne, managed to break through the perimeter, his determined advance bringing him close to the house. He was fueled by rage and the humiliation of their stalled assault. He burst through a back door, weapon raised, expecting to find a cowering old man. Instead, he found an empty room, bathed in shadow, a chilling silence hanging in the air. As he stepped further in, a sudden, swift movement from above, a shadow detaching itself from the ceiling, was all he registered before a hard, precise blow to the temple sent him sprawling, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. John stood over him, breathing evenly, his movements economical and lethal. He didn't waste a second. He secured Thorne, ensuring he was conscious enough to feel the fear, but too disoriented to resist, and then disappeared back into the darkness. The tide had turned completely. The Syndicate, initially confident in their overwhelming numbers, now found themselves scattered, confused, and increasingly terrified. They were being picked off one by one, not with brute force, but with an unsettling efficiency that left them questioning their sanity. Radios crackled with desperate, fragmented reports. "He's everywhere. We can't see him. He's like a phantom." Victor's face, usually composed, was now contorted with a mixture of disbelief and growing terror. He had sent his men to take a ranch, and instead, he had unleashed a nightmare. The quiet old man was proving to be a force of nature, a legend reborn, and Victor knew, with a sinking feeling, that his Syndicate had made a grave, perhaps fatal, error in judgment. The raid was no longer about taking the ranch. It was about survival, and the odds were suddenly, terrifyingly, stacked against them. The night was drawing to a close, but the psychological battle was far from over. Victor, now operating on pure adrenaline and a growing sense of desperation, ordered his remaining men to converge on the main house. He reasoned that if they could corner the rancher, overwhelm him with sheer numbers, they might still salvage something from this disastrous operation. He barked orders into his comms, his voice hoarse with frustration and a hint of fear. His lieutenants, those who hadn't been disoriented, captured, or simply vanished into the terrifying night, rallied, pushing forward with a renewed, albeit fragile, resolve. They formed a tighter perimeter, weapons held high, their eyes scanning every shadow, every window, convinced that the ghost was now trapped. John, however, was never trapped. He anticipated their desperate maneuver, reading their desperation as clearly as if it were written on a map. His strategy shifted from defensive disorientation to a more direct engagement. He allowed them to close in, drawing them into a kill zone he had meticulously prepared. As the Syndicate operatives breached the final outer defenses, a series of blinding flashbangs erupted, followed by ear-splitting concussions. The sudden assault threw them into utter chaos, their training momentarily forgotten in the face of sensory overload. Disoriented and screaming, they stumbled, their formations breaking apart. This was the moment John had been waiting for. Moving with incredible speed and precision, John engaged them. He didn't use his rifle now. He moved like a shadow, using hand-to-hand combat techniques honed over decades in the world's most dangerous arenas. Each strike was calculated, designed to incapacitate, to disarm, to render his opponents harmless without lethal force. He moved through them like a whirlwind, a blur of motion and practiced violence. He disarmed one, tripped another, used their own momentum against them. He was a force of nature, a living testament to what a human being could become when pushed to the absolute limits of survival and defense. The Syndicate men, so confident in their firearms, found themselves utterly outmatched by a man who moved like a phantom, who could vanish and reappear at will, and whose hands were as lethal as any weapon. Victor, witnessing the systematic dismantling of his elite team firsthand, finally understood. This wasn't a rancher. This was him. The legendary operative, the ghost from the darkest chapters of their organization's history. The man they had believed to be long dead. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stripping away his arrogance and leaving only raw, primal terror. He saw John move, a fleeting glimpse of a face etched with grim determination. And in that instant, he recognized the eyes of a man who had walked through hell and emerged unbroken. There was no victory here, only survival. And for Victor, the only option left was to run. He turned, abandoning his men, and scrambled back towards his vehicle, a desperate, pathetic retreat. But John was already there, a silent sentinel by the driver's side door, Buster growling low at his heels. The Syndicate's reign of terror on his land was over. The morning sun would soon rise, painting the sky with the promise of a new day, a peace earned not with quiet living, but with the brutal reawakening of a dormant warrior. The night was drawing to a close, but the psychological battle was far from over. Victor, now operating on pure adrenaline and a growing sense of desperation, ordered his remaining men to converge on the main house. He reasoned that if they could corner the rancher, overwhelm him with sheer numbers, they might still salvage something from this disastrous operation. He barked orders into his comms, his voice hoarse with frustration and a hint of fear. His lieutenants, those who hadn't been disoriented, captured, or simply vanished into the terrifying night, rallied, pushing forward with a renewed, albeit fragile, resolve. They formed a tighter perimeter, weapons held high, their eyes scanning every shadow, every window, convinced that the ghost was now trapped. John, however, was never trapped. He anticipated their desperate maneuver, reading their desperation as clearly as if it were written on a map. His strategy shifted from defensive disorientation to a more direct engagement. He allowed them to close in, drawing them into a kill zone he had meticulously prepared. As the Syndicate operatives breached the final outer defenses, a series of blinding flashbangs erupted, followed by ear-splitting concussions. The sudden assault threw them into utter chaos, their training momentarily forgotten in the face of sensory overload. Disoriented and screaming, they stumbled, their formations breaking apart. This was the moment John had been waiting for. Moving with incredible speed and precision, John engaged them. He didn't use his rifle now. He moved like a shadow, using hand-to-hand combat techniques honed over decades in the world's most dangerous arenas. Each strike was calculated, designed to incapacitate, to disarm, to render his opponents harmless without lethal force. He moved through them like a whirlwind, a blur of motion and practiced violence. He disarmed one, tripped another, used their own momentum against them. He was a force of nature, a living testament to what a human being could become when pushed to the absolute limits of survival and defense. The Syndicate men, so confident in their firearms, found themselves utterly outmatched by a man who moved like a phantom, who could vanish and reappear at will, and whose hands were as lethal as any weapon. Victor, witnessing the systematic dismantling of his elite team firsthand, finally understood. This wasn't a rancher. This was him. The legendary operative, the ghost from the darkest chapters of their organization's history, the man they had believed to be long dead. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stripping away his arrogance and leaving only raw, primal terror. He saw John move, a fleeting glimpse of a face etched with grim determination, and in that instant he recognized the eyes of a man who had walked through hell and emerged unbroken. There was no victory here, only survival, and for Victor, the only option left was to run. He turned, abandoning his men, and scrambled back towards his vehicle, a desperate, pathetic retreat. But John was already there, a silent sentinel by the driver's side door, Buster growling low at his heels. The Syndicate's reign of terror on his land was over. The morning sun would soon rise, painting the sky with the promise of a new day, a peace earned not with quiet living, but with the brutal reawakening of a dormant warrior. As the first tendrils of dawn painted the eastern sky with soft hues of violet and gold, a profound stillness settled over the ranch. The chaos of the night had subsided, replaced by the quiet aftermath of a battle fought and won. John stood amidst the wreckage, surveying the scattered, disoriented Syndicate operatives who were slowly, painfully, regaining their senses. They lay stunned, some groaning, others simply staring blankly at the sky, their weapons scattered uselessly around them. Buster moved among them, a low, satisfied rumble in his chest, occasionally nudging a prone figure with his nose, a silent guardian ensuring no one made a sudden move. John felt the familiar ache in his muscles, the lingering adrenaline coursing through his veins, but beneath it all, there was a deep sense of weary satisfaction. He had defended his home, his peace, and in doing so, he had confronted the ghosts of his past. The decision to disarm and incapacitate, rather than to kill, was a deliberate choice, a testament to the man he had become. He wasn't the relentless operative driven by vengeance or cold calculation anymore. He was John, the rancher, a man who valued life, even the lives of those who sought to destroy his. He knew the Syndicate would be crippled by this, their reputation for ruthless efficiency shattered by a single, determined man they had foolishly underestimated. He moved methodically, securing the remaining operatives, ensuring they were bound and unable to escape. He made a call, not to the authorities, but to a very specific, trusted contact from his old life, a man who understood the nuances of such situations and could ensure these individuals would be dealt with in a way that truly dismantled the Syndicate's local operations, far more effectively than any conventional law enforcement could. This was not about justice in a courtroom. It was about ensuring the ranch, his sanctuary, would never be threatened again. As the sun fully emerged, casting long shadows across the dew-kissed fields, John looked out over his land. The pines still whispered, the horses still grazed, and the air still carried the scent of fresh earth. The peace had returned, but it was a different kind of peace now, one forged in the crucible of conflict, one that acknowledged the darkness of the world but reaffirmed the enduring power of a single individual to stand against it. He knew the scars of the night would linger, but so too would the quiet triumph of protecting what he loved. He had faced his past, embraced the dormant warrior within, and found a way to weave that power into the fabric of his peaceful present. The legend lived on, not in the shadows, but in the unwavering strength of a man who simply wanted to be left alone, but who, when pushed, could remind the world of the immense power of a quiet resolve. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates tales of quiet strength and enduring spirit.